okay, camp counselors, we're headed to Camp Crystal Lake. Let's just hope we end up being the final girls. The original era of the Friday the 13th franchise consisted of 8 feature films that released throughout the 1980s. These movies mainly focus on the character of Jason Voorhees, who was thought to have drowned as a boy at Camp Crystal Lake in the 1950s. Okay, so I did not go into this summer planning on watching all of these movies, but here we are. A week and a half later, I'm all the better for it, I think. My interest in watching these films all started because recently it dawned on me I've never seen the movie where Jason gets his iconic hockey mask. Like, it seems kind of silly because I'm very aware of, marketing and popularity in the horror genre, but it never really occurred to me until recently that I did not get that far in the franchise to even understand the story behind that. Another factor pushing me to dive back into these franchise films after seeing the first original one several years back and then subsequently multiple times in my life is that I just love a summer camp setting. I love how isolated it is. I love that there are so many themes in that setting that you could pull on about, American culture and society. I love how wholesome a summer camp setting is because there is that expectation of fun and nostalgia and youthful, adventure that is getting very contrasted by danger, death, and violence. So I dove right in watching part 2 and then 3 and then 4. And then the next thing you know, I'm like, I am very much into this. I didn't really get it at first. Like, these are the movies that people love and lump in with the likes of Chucky and Scream as like this modern horror pantheon. So I think it took me some time to figure out exactly where to put this franchise. And also it took me some time to figure out how I should be watching it and what my expectations should be. I had to kind of accept that there's going to be some predictability here and that actually, down the road became something that was kind of comforting for me. So I feel like my experience watching part 2 was definitely overshadowed by the fact that I was kind of confused at how we went from the original to that one. But now it's sitting with me a little bit more. And then I saw part 3 and I was like, you know what? I'm all in. I very much am enjoying myself. I was hooked or completely brainwashed, one of the two, because I did watch these movies back to back to back, and that will do a number on you after a while. And then when the horror in this franchise evolved into another kind of subgenre, I was already of the mindset that I believe this, I'm here. I'll go with you on this journey. I honestly just believe anything is possible in the Jason universe. So yeah, throw anything you got at me and I will accept it. I'll believe it. I think a lot of my enjoyment of these movies is that it is a masterclass in horror tropes, specifically for the slasher film. It picked up what the Halloween movie put down and ran with it and expanded it. Even though we saw a whole lot of predictability and tropiness in these films throughout the entire franchise, to the point where you're able to actually in the first 10-15 minutes of the film point out who will survive, who won't, and in which order, I still felt like there is this certain element of surprise in each Friday the 13th movie. You need to watch to the very, very end because they'll flip a switch, they'll do something different, even if in the next movie they completely forget that there's something that needs to be tied up because of the ending of the film prior. The inconsistencies were a little annoying. I'm really happy I gave this franchise a shot and then I stuck with it, even though there was that slight adjustment period of figuring out how one should be watching these movies. And I really do feel like there are some critical curiosities, if I'm looking beyond just pure enjoyment, that I have about this franchise. For one, I'm really curious to know how people feel about the ways that disability is, represented in these movies. I could see both arguments here, people viewing Jason and just all the Friday the 13th movies is exploiting disability, or one could even make the argument that, he's exerting control over his life. He's expressing agency in ways that, yeah, they're violent, but he's not being a passive player in his life. And something that also stuck out to me as I was watching these movies, specifically the first one, is a lot of the Native American iconography and imagery that is not a central part of the plot or the story, but there's little things here and there that you'll see or that characters will do. And I just was really curious about how that plays into the larger themes of this movie. And there is a really cool article, which I'll link below, that talks about this in a little bit more detail from the horror homeroom. I also wanted to do a quick ranking of my favorite final girls of the 1980s movies within this franchise. And in the process of trying to rank these fictional female characters for many factors, including their personality, their backstory, character development arc, and then also the ways in which they took down Jason or whoever the villain is in the individual movies, I really became super curious about what they would look like and how my decision would be very different if there were female filmmakers contributing significantly to the creation of these movies. I've also seen male writers, filmmakers create really multidimensional female fictional characters, but I just felt like there was so many lost opportunities for a lot of these women in this list to really just hit the mark for me. And I just think it had a lot to do with the priorities of the filmmakers on this set. I'm not even commenting on the gratuitous, levels of sexuality, which goes hand in hand within, the horror genre. It's more so the ways in which we did or didn't get to know some of these women, or their decisions where it just felt like they weren't consistent in terms of their characterization throughout the course of a movie, which then led me to feel a little bit frustrated about them being less useful than they really could have been in taking down Jason. Let's start off with my least favorite final girl of the 1980s movies, and that honor goes to Rennie Wickham. Rennie. I was confused with the entirety of this movie. All of those flashbacks or visions she was seeing of a little boy drowning. And at the very, very end of the movie, we get, the reveal as to what that was all about. I don't know why they waited to the very end. It didn't help make anything that happened after all the more impactful. It honestly felt like the character didn't know what movie they were in. The whole plot point with her guardian or stepfather felt so melodramatic and not something I would think would be dropped into the universe of Jason. I appreciated that she had something that she was working through, but it just felt super disjointed. I just have this idea in my head of a final girl being very resourceful, quick on her feet, making decisions on the fly, and really being a very active participant in taking down Jason or whoever the villain is. And it just felt like a lot of what she did and how she was able to, be successful by the end of this movie really came down to just sheer luck. Ultimately, I just found Rennie to be very boring and one-dimensional. Number 7 is Pam Roberts. There's a few final girls on this list where out of nowhere, they're the final girl. There's no point where we get to connect with this character or learn anything about them, but then we're supposed to identify with them and really root for them at the end of this movie in that third act. Pam is one of those final girls, so I was not invested at the end of the story when it came to her and that one-on-one interaction with her and Jason at the end. And she had a whole lot of help from Tommy Jarvis and Reckless Reggie. I love him. He's so adorable. And I love that they teamed up. I love that it was a team effort. But if we're thinking about this trope of the final girl, I don't really feel like she had her moment to really shine and embrace that archetype fully. Number 6 is Trish Jarvis. Personally, for me, I don't feel like she fits the criteria that makes up a final girl. And to my knowledge, being the one that finally takes down the villain at the end of the horror film, that is what bestows you the honor of the final girl status. But many people include Trish on the list because she is the last female character to survive Jason in these films. Sadly, she's just as forgettable as Rennie and Pam. I do not think of her when I think of Friday the 13th final girls. For me personally, I give a lot of credit to finally taking down Jason to her little brother, Tommy Jarvis, who is played by Corey Feldman. Very shocked to see that he's in these movies, but I think he did a superb acting job for such a young kid. Although Trish puts up one hell of a fight, is, sacrificing herself for the safety of her younger brother. It's his makeup skills, it's his wisdom far beyond his years of being a little kid that really gets him out of the mess. Moving on to number 5, for me, that is Megan Garris. Megan has to be one of the most fun and enjoyable to watch final girls in the entire franchise for me. However, I felt like her characterization was so inconsistent. Once we got to that final act, she was just doing things and making decisions and choices that just did not match who we had learned her to be throughout, the first portion of this movie. She is so rebellious. She is challenging her father, who is, the police officer of this town, and she's doing some very daring stuff. She's thinking super quickly on her feet. What she lacked in backstory or some kind of like internal narrative arc of sorts, she definitely made up for in personality. So I feel like that made me really interested in her as a character because she was just so unique, so different than the female characters that had been written into this franchise before this film. But the second she gets back to Camp Crystal Lake and sees what has happened to her fellow counselors, it's like her brain totally switches off and she becomes a completely different character. To me, she just felt it's so sad because this was such a missed opportunity to create a very well-rounded fictional female character in this franchise. And of course, nobody's gonna be perfect in these kind of scenarios. It is, fight or flight. I just felt like it was not compatible with who we had gotten to know her as earlier in the movie. Like, she is screaming and she is getting herself into situations where I'm like, okay, God, I've never been so frustrated. At the end, she is pretty instrumental in taking down Jason and helping save Tommy's life, but it really does feel like this is the Tommy Jarvis show in this movie, and she's just like a bit character on the side being wholly underutilized. Anywho, moving on to number 4. Don't hate me, guys, but this is Alice for me. I know she is the original final girl of the franchise. I just wish I had more to say about her. I don't really know too much about her except that she was a camp counselor at Crystal Lake, and she also loves to draw. That's not enough for me to really be invested in a character. I just wish I had more to say about her. It's just interesting to note, looking back on this movie, that we get more emotional vulnerability from Marcy than we do from Alice. With Alice, I did not have that kind of emotional connection, maybe like making us feel something for one character, but then not the other, kind of has us maybe guessing about who actually will survive to the end. That final kill, though, is pretty epic, so credit where credit is definitely due. Getting into my top 3 favorite final girls of the franchise, this is favorites territory for sure, where I have very little to complain about. Number 3 is Ginny Fields, which is funny because part 2 was not my favorite. It kind of did take some time for me to embrace this movie and embrace her as being, a crucial part of this franchise. I feel like as a final girl, she's very much ahead of her time. I love how one of her greatest strengths is her intelligence, and that writers just allowed her to use that and wield that almost like a weapon. I mean, she has to wield weapons, like physical ones, down the road, and she's the one who gives that like final blow. So to me, she's very much like, hitting all the marks, all that criteria for what makes up a final girl, in my opinion. But it's that special element of letting us know she's a child psychology major, and she has a great level of empathy for Jason. She's not the final girl that I connected the most with in this franchise, but she, out of all of these, just feels so real. Like, she's a real human walking around, and it was a real human responding very quickly and resourcefully to such a crisis. They really should have removed all of those flashbacks from the first movie that took up, 10, 15 minutes, and use that time instead to let us get to know Ginny more and, just kind of flesh her out a little bit more as a character. That would have been way better use of time, in my opinion. Number 2 is Chris Higgins. I've kind of gathered here and there that people don't necessarily love this movie, but I really enjoyed it. I thought the Shelley character was so adorable, and this is finally where we find out how Jason gets his iconic ski mask. So I was sat for this one. Part 3 has some of my favorite characters in the entire franchise. Like, this friend group is so wholesome, so sweet, and this is probably the one friend group where I was like really sad to see them go. I loved that Chris had a backstory, albeit a little bit random, but unlike with Rennie, I appreciated that the filmmakers gave us her backstory, her connection to Crystal Lake and Jason earlier on in the movie, so that wasn't the reveal towards the end. Everything that happened after that was really impactful. I was rooting for Chris because there's a lot of SA innuendo in that attack. It's more so her working through this violation of personal space and privacy that feels so violent for her. Every time she swung at Jason, it meant more than just survival. It was like her taking back something that he took away from her. And she's so brave in confronting it. She doesn't have a whole lot of help from other people. So that really does solidify her in my mind as being a very, very strong final girl. So if you're keeping count, it's pretty obvious at this point who is my #1 final girl of the Friday the 13th franchise. And that is very much a fan favorite from what I've heard so far. Tina Shepard. We find Tina towards the end of this franchise, and by that point, I had started to really feel like they've gotten the rhythm of, not only who Jason is by this point, but also like who the final girl archetype is. We get backstory with her. We get, really interesting characters that interact with her. We have, a lot of interesting new horror elements being added into the mix at this point. This lady does damage on Jason. Like, she is throwing furniture at him. He is falling through the floor. He is getting electrified by her. Let me tell you, it was a whole lot of fun to see her embrace something about her that she just has felt has been such a weight and something that is so negative, to have her then use it to survive, to defend herself. That's so powerful. And I know we're talking about telekinesis here, but you could use that as a stand-in for so much about the female experience that is demonized by society. You have this psychiatrist who's exploiting her, and she just feels so much pressure from the guilt of things in her past, to feel like she's wielding something that has brought her so much pain in her life that's so meaningful to see on screen. I also really loved the mother and daughter dynamic. I could have definitely gone without having her with a love interest in this movie. It didn't feel like it made sense. It felt a little forced, but that's definitely par for the course with a quintessential slasher. I guess they can't think of any unique way to connect those two households. I was genuinely sad to see the mother go, but parents do not last long in this franchise, I noticed. Despite the fact that the ending of this movie was so silly, and technically Tina had a hand in making that happen. So I guess, she does deliver the final blow in many cases. She still is my favorite final girl of the entire franchise, and somebody that I feel had such a strong presence in the movie from beginning to the very, very end. If it isn't already obvious, I had the time of my life spending the last week and a half watching these movies. I think I would consider watching the 90s and early 2000s films that I did not get to. But some people believe that this franchise never should have left the 80s. Do you agree? Are these things I should check out? I'd love to know if your final girl ranking is similar or different to mine, or which of the movies are your favorites. Let me know down below in the comments. I'm really excited to chat with you about all things Jason and Friday the 13th. I will see you all in my next video. Bye.